Hi, and welcome to the Human Side of Business podcast. I'm Ange Maria, CEO and co-founder of Intuity Performance. I'm a performance coach, HR professional, whole person leadership facilitator, and your host. The Human Side of Business podcast is fueled by the genuine curiosity to understand how personal characteristics and skills can be leveraged to drive individual and team performance, tangible outcomes, and ultimately organizational success within business. Each podcast is devoted to sharing knowledge, expanding our learning edges, and exploring the trends in corporate culture towards growing the emotional intelligence of organizations. I'm so glad you're here. Hi, and welcome to the Human Side of Business podcast. I'm Ange Maria, CEO and co-founder of Intuity Performance. I'm a performance coach, HR professional, whole person leadership facilitator, and your host. The Human Side of Business podcast is fueled by the genuine curiosity to understand how personal characteristics and skills can be leveraged to drive individual and team performance, tangible outcomes, and ultimately organizational success within business. Each podcast is devoted to sharing knowledge, expanding our learning edges, and exploring the trends in corporate culture towards growing the emotional intelligence of organizations. I'm so glad you're here. Welcome back to the Human Side of Business podcast. Today, we're diving into a topic that feels more relevant than ever: compassion-driven leadership. Whether you're leading a small team or an entire organization, the importance of empathy and compassion can't be overstated in today's world. With me is Maria, our senior consultant and performance coach, someone I know who has a lot of passion for this topic. Maria, how's it going?
Thanks, Ange. I do have a lot of passion for this topic. You know, leadership is often seen as the hitting targets and grit, but compassion is a real game changer. And it's not just the fluffy stuff. We're talking real results, measurable impact.
Exactly. And today we're going to unpack why compassion isn't just a nice to have, but a must have if you're serious about building engaged, collaborative teams. All right. Let's start by tackling the what is compassion definition, because there are so many different ways that people are exhibiting compassion and identifying what compassion is in the workplace. I want to get your take, Maria, as to what you believe compassion really is and how it shows up in the workplace.
Absolutely. I think we all, or most of us, are probably familiar with Brene Brown's take on sympathy and empathy. And I feel like comparing and contrasting empathy and compassion is another really good way of framing compassion. So how it's different from empathy and some current discoveries in the examination of the two in an article that I read from Forbes by Rasmus Hugard really resonated with me, and I think it really resonated with you. And he argues that compassion is more beneficial than empathy in leadership and society. So empathy involves feeling others' emotions. It can lead to emotional burnout, is what is suggested. And compassion, in contrast, allows for understanding and support without becoming overwhelmed.
Right.
So compassionate leaders can act more objectively, foster resilience, and create a positive impact because it encourages constructive responses rather than sharing someone else's pain.
Right.
So it ultimately supports healthier and more sustainable relationships and workplaces. His suggestion is that because compassion is not instinctive or purely emotional, the way empathy is, it can be trained and developed just like any other leadership skill.
And that really resonated with me because oftentimes in the workplace, what I would hear is leaders asking, well, how can I be empathetic but still be professional? And there was some stickiness around that word or emotion. And hearing the definition of compassion and the intention of it, I was like, okay, I'm fully in.
Yeah.
I'm jumping over the fence to compassion versus empathy.
Absolutely. Yeah. So in going a bit further, so in some of the research I've been doing with the examination of empathy, it suggests that empathy is the tendency to join in others' suffering, like I said a second ago, particularly those who are close to us. So this is kind of the key piece to hone in on in why empathy is different than compassion. So I'll say that again. Empathy is the tendency to join in others' suffering, particularly those who are close to us. But empathy is limited. When it comes to helping outsiders who are suffering, our brains perceive it as hard work and reject the effort, while our instinct is to support and protect our in-group. We can perceive outsiders as part of an out-group and a threat to our social identity. A recent study found that empathy triggered from social connection makes it more likely that we will dehumanize individuals seen as belonging to an out-group. In its extreme, empathy can fuel aversion to those who are different from us.
Right.
So
that's feeling a bit divisive.
Yeah, exactly. So the suggestion is that the root of empathy has the potential to drive division rather than coming together because it's so deeply rooted in our brain science.
Right.
It's basically a safety mechanism. You relate to and work with and have relationship with whereas if you're exercising compassion, it's not so much about psychological safety, I guess, perhaps.
Absolutely. And when we're looking at it, you said something really important, I think, the science behind compassionate leadership and bringing it full circle as to, okay, well, what does that mean in the real world? We know that there's real science there from evidence-backed studies or business cases, especially coming out of the Center for Creative Leadership. They've shown leaders who really prioritize compassion have teams that report 70% higher engagement levels than their counterparts. 70%.
I know that was a staggering percentage.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then when we're looking at it from an HBR or Harvard Business Review perspective, what they've identified through their studies is that compassionate leaders see a 50% boost in employee trust and loyalty. Yeah. And being an entrepreneur and going through the exercise of what does that mean from a dollar value perspective, when you have 70% more engagement, you're saving on not just time, but the ROI of the actual salaries that you're paying for your team members.
Absolutely.
70%. Yeah. And then when you're thinking about it from trust and loyalty, 50%, well, automatically my HR brain goes to, okay, well, that is going to create psychological safety for employees. And it's also going to be able to reduce turnover substantively, retention. Right?
Absolutely.
And then again, tying it back to dollars and cents, that's 2 times a person's salary in this day and age. Some would argue 3, depending on where you look, but you're looking at $160,000 savings just for embedding compassion within your leadership or tying compassion to operational leadership.
And I think also just helping your team understand, because we've been, I think the trend has been toward empathy for some time, but helping your team understand the difference between empathy and compassion and knowing being able to recognize their own personal flags when maybe, now isn't the time to deploy my empathetic self and let's come over to compassion. Or maybe because, I can speak to this from experience for myself, is that because I'm naturally more highly sensitive, an empathetic space is just a little perhaps too close. And so how for, our highly sensitive leaders, how can we bolster their compassion to make sure that, our burnout rates stay low, our engagement stays high. And ultimately, our turnover rates are low and everybody's happy.
I think that's an awesome example. And what was screaming to me in the sense of like, okay, this all sounds really great, but how to?
Yeah.
And I tend to like, I guess, sidebar, ever since upgrading as a coach, oftentimes the ethics or the values or the principles and methodologies behind coaching has stayed with me, even in personal relationships.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's almost like fully bred into me now. So when you're saying things like, when do you flip the switch for compassion and versus empathy? I like that thought process because it's not saying that empathy is bad and compassion's better. And a coach approach question comes up in me as to, okay, as leaders, how can we stop and reflect in what situations could we foresee the need for compassion versus empathy? Because that's really being able to quote unquote read the room, right?
Yeah. And what's coming up for me there is the examination of your own personal biases. So if empathy tends to naturally show up when you're with, the like-minded people or the folks that are like you, knowing that, recognizing that, watching that come up. So am I still reading this objectively? Am I still supporting my teammate from an objective stance that supports them in the best possible way? Or is this, am I too heavy into empathy in this moment to be able to give them that objective support?
Absolutely. And I think that is pointing to not just what is my leadership why, but when we're thinking about leadership skill sets and emotional intelligence. So i.e. compassion can be tied to emotional intelligence via empathy, I would say. Maybe I'm wrong. Arguing point for sure. However, what I think is that we know that this is necessity. It's necessary for or essential for leadership. However, the conduit to get there is really vague. Like, so how do we get leaders to really start to think that if I want to increase my operations, productivity, sales, ROI on investments, et cetera, or salaries, how do we get them tying the fact that if you have higher levels of emotional intelligence and or compassion, especially, that's going to drive your engagement versus, the company ping pong table and parties and, retreats and getaways, albeit they're good. They're nice. It's good for connecting 100%.
Yeah.
But it's starting to get leaders to think that not just compassion, but all emotional intelligence or human soft skills are absolutely needed to lead in this day and age.
Yeah.
So,
and it's driven from within. It starts with self.
Yes.
So like you said, the ping pong tables can be great, but that's not going to be the thing that shapes your culture.
Very much so.
Those external niceties are great complementary, tools or benefits to what the leaders in your organization can exhibit through their soft skills.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Tying it back to business cases, it's really just identifying that through compassion, you're not just looking at payroll numbers, you're looking at individual team members after understanding yourself. Sorry, I want to acknowledge that.
Yeah. I
really enjoyed your point in that it's an internal dive first from a leadership perspective before we can even lead someone else, is what I was kind of hearing. And so, when we're thinking about large companies like Microsoft, for example, Satya Nadella is a huge case that we have within some of our facilitation offerings. We've heard it in other TED Talks, etc. But statistically speaking, we know that by having empathy and compassion, he led that culture, turned the culture around, and led it to being a $250 billion increase in market value. And is that kind of soft in the sense of proof? You could argue it. However, when you see strong cultures and organizations and people are feeling connected and considered, or that there's compassion within the organization, they're more than likely going to stay, which then can provide you with solid numbers as to,
Absolutely.
And
I think that we're seeing, and certainly my own interest in compassion and leadership has gone up since the pandemic.
Yes.
I would certainly say that we're just seeing across the board globally more instances of people coming to work as their whole selves. And that just needs to be acknowledged. I don't think there's a lot of room to ignore that now.
No.
And I would say certainly we see this in Nova Scotia. One of the prime examples is our healthcare system. We're seeing extreme levels of burnout because, I guess there's lots of potential reasons we could point to.
Yes.
But is compassion at the forefront, and
it's debatable, I would say.
Debatable, yeah.
Yeah.
And from, the very tippy top. And the healthcare system may be a bit of a complex example to use because it's so heavily driven by politics, but then also that may be a good example of compassion driven leadership. How can that be put into play when so removed from the thing that you're trying to lead?
I think to me, like, one, that could be a totally different episode because of the layers of that onion, which I absolutely love. Maybe it's going to be one, I don't know. But the other thing that's coming up for me is that when you're looking, using your words, at the tippy top of an organization, how are they keeping compassion top of mind is my first question. Oftentimes it's not, and it's not from a place of being, a monster or ill intent or what have you. Malice is kind of what was coming up for me as a word, but thinking it through in the sense that because, especially using that environment, i.e. healthcare, it's been so taxed over the past few years, which has kind of like shown, pulled back the water to show the rocks of some systematic things that need to be fixed, politics or otherwise. With that, those seem to take precedent over focusing on human skills and the values. And I think that this is actually a prime example of how things can be so disassociated from humans.
Absolutely.
And you see the breakdown, the errors, the disconnection, the burnout, the psychological unsafety in the front lines of healthcare. I think, in my opinion, obviously biases in there too, because we do not have the model or the ways of integrating things like compassion and empathy into the workplace as a quote unquote norm.
Yes.
I don't think it's because people don't want to do it. They just don't know how.
Yeah. And as a skill that you can build, work on, augment, and again, going to a place of a healthcare example, because I think it just illustrates what we were talking about earlier, where perhaps, it could be said that there are lots of empathetic folks in caregiving roles, for example.
Right.
And so, again, managers and leaders having an awareness of, sure, what's in your employees' job descriptions, but what is being asked of them in the roles that they're in, and what's kind of the unspoken, desire that they give in the role. And then distinguishing, maybe the vulnerabilities to being highly empathetic, and that, perhaps not working in the context that they're in.
Absolutely. And I think that paints a really profound picture of why compassion is really essential for leadership.
Mhm.
Taking it a step further, like, what are your thoughts on compassion as it's tied to driving collaboration and engagement within teams?
Yeah, I think well, full stop, I think it does drive collaboration in teams. I think that it can create a structure or a sense of safety. So when leaders are compassionate, they foster psychological safety.
Right.
So your staff will have a belief that they won't be punished for speaking up or making mistakes. So there's just a foundation of trust, I would say. So it creates a more creative, innovative, open
Right.
scenario for sure.
I'm remembering that Google did a project, and I really enjoyed this business case, and again, bringing it into facilitation engagements because it was so clear and profound to many things like psychological safety and compassion. And so basically, they did what was called Project Aristotle. And I may kind of mess up some of the details or facts, but all this to say is that they looked at things like, well, is it the behaviors in the team? And it wasn't so much. Obviously, there's weight there. It was, looking at what was allowing for some of their teams to be highly productive versus productive, which is good.
Yeah.
But they were really interested in understanding the highly productive. And the number one factor was that it was psychological safety in those high performing teams. And I get goosebumps every time I say that because this is Google, a tech company that is world renowned. It's like a big player. They did their own internal study and found out that it had nothing to do with like technical skills, but rather how are we defining psychological safety and therefore living it in the workplace?
Yeah.
Meaning that for Google, they would do things like sharing stats. And stats weren't just about projects, but it could be about someone's performance or some other formality of a detail in the sense that brings connectivity and that it normalizes that it's okay to talk about performance and what's going on because they're looking at it in my interpretation of the study. They're looking at it from the perspective of, this is our baseline. This is where we want to go. And these are the problems that we need to solve to get there. And to me, that is a version of compassion.
Absolutely. And I just want to point out the language that you're using is, and I don't know if that's just how you read it or if that's how it was shared in the document, but the language of we, there's a collective kind of language rather than
I think that's me.
Yeah.
The goofy Canadian in me.
No, but it's good if that's the case to me because it shows that at first or your natural interpretation, I guess, of that information or the way that you would go about that is from a team or a collective rather than a manager having KPIs that we need to hit. And let's take this to performance management if it doesn't work,
Right. And I think that's where there's some stickiness between how do you become a leadership coach or lead within, or sorry, the coach approach within leadership versus, systems and systematic approaches from an HR perspective. Because I agree with you. Like, when I was highly practicing HR within organizations, it really felt like it was a box or black and white. And if we were having a problem with an employee in the organizations I worked for at the time, we'll say, it was very systematic in the sense of, 1, 2, 3, structure out. And that's what was trained and that's what was known at that time. to me, it didn't feel humanized.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because oftentimes when it comes to the compassion piece, that's where the what and the how and the why. And also, by the way, organization, what are we doing to set up our team members for success? So accountability, I think, aligns with that too.
Yeah.
I don't know where I was going with that point, but that's just kind of what came up for me.
No, I think it was a very valid point.
Ultimately, it's like when you show compassion, when you have the ability to show compassion and the want to show compassion in the workplace, that's when people feel valued.
Yeah.
Like that's when you reach, it's not just a checkbox of, okay, it's a safe environment to talk, but rather when the leader isn't in the room, that's when the culture happens.
Yeah.
So the other team members are speaking to each other like that. And it's coming in from a place of really trying to understand each other, and we're collectively working towards the same goal.
Yeah.
Like I've seen it in past where clients would have two internal departments that were so competitive. And it took me a minute to wrap my head around it because they had the exact same goals. Like the departments literally had both objective and subjective goals were exactly the same, and they were so competitive. And when we dug down a little bit deeper from a leadership perspective, it was that they had the old belief that to lead a successful team, it has to be competitive. Like I win versus you lose.
Right.
And anybody who out there who's read Covey's story, obviously, there's things that can debate that.
Absolutely.
It doesn't need to be competitive. Sure, it could be competitive.
Yeah.
But it doesn't. How can I say this?
Lose.
Yeah, it's not a
win-lose.
Yes. And I don't even mean from the other side. Like, I don't mean it to sound even super warm and fuzzy that it's like you get a participation award either.
Yeah.
But rather it's just that natural, I don't know if it's natural. It's the middle of the road in the sense of coming in from a place of logic and intention, I think is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And I think they're ultimately what you're trying to foster with compassionate leadership is tapping into your teams and hopefully your own an intrinsic motivation to work toward these shared goals.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Meaning an intrinsic motivation, meaning that I'm not just giving you a bonus. I'm not just paying you to do this, but rather you see value in your role and understand the connection and the impact for the organization. Therefore, it becomes your agenda too. Exactly. And you're self-motivated.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's very circular because I would say that would go away if you didn't have compassionate leadership. It's going to feel more transactional.
Very much so.
So again, with leadership has to make the first move in being compassionate because that's what will form that safety that will then allow people to tap into that intrinsic motivation and it will grow exponentially from there.
Absolutely. Thinking about it too from like a non extreme case of being critical versus compassion is something as simple as leadership team saying things like, oh, I have to handhold. And even if that's heard in halls or like in the hallways of offices or on your Teams meeting or on a Zoom meeting, that's coming from a place of being criticism versus compassion.
Yeah.
And what I've seen, leaders could be in their role for 20 some odd years and they're superstars at what they do.
Yeah.
So the things that we judge are often things that we had to overcome ourselves.
Yes.
And I think that we could tie the level of compassion to that by way of if you're having a critical thought prior to saying anything out loud, asking yourself the question, am I judging or am I being compassionate? Because like in the past 4 years of coaching leaders, I've definitely seen that we have the natural ability, i.e. biases, to want to put people in boxes so that we can classify it and leave it alone.
Yeah.
Versus looking at team members as almost like a plant. Like they transform, they can change if they want to. You know, I mean, there's situations, of course, where they have to go down the road with HR and performance improvement, et cetera. But that aside, bringing it to like an everyday normalcy perspective or normal situation, it's thinking about it from the perspective of we're evolving. And, you know, we're not staying stagnant. Just because they're having a hard time with this now doesn't mean it's going to be tomorrow or even the next week, right? Maybe it is, but then it's also asking what resources do they need? How do they learn? Like, I really think that when it comes to compassion, there's a level of responsibility or accountability in there that leadership ought to have, because without it, you know, you're losing team members, you're getting clock watchers, you're not having individuals that are intrinsically motivated.
So do you think the biggest sign that your compassion isn't switched on is kind of a one size fits all approach? So if you know, so if you notice in your work, you're kind of expecting the same from everyone, that's probably a bit of a moment to do some self-reflection.
Absolutely. And adding to that definition, because there definitely can be others, but the thing that's really popping out for me is it's not just about one size fits all, but rather, are your expectations in alignment with where they're at? Right? Because, I mean, how many of us out there has had a boss or a leader and they've said, hey, do this thing for me without instruction? And then we do that thing, and the reaction that we get from the leader is not overtly positive, if positive at all. It's because the leader has their own judgments and expectations in play. They're not communicating them. The team member fails, and then therefore they get to judge them. So passive leadership is what is, I guess I'm coming to.
Kind of
in the sense
the
that
opposite end of compassionate is passive.
Passive leadership could definitely be the opposite end. And I think that's what you're pointing to, that active or intentional leadership allows for us to pause, reflect, look at how we want our team members to perform. And if it's high performance that we're looking for, then it's high intentionality with how we're treating them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest instances that I've witnessed in some of the environments that I've worked with is the transition from, a staff person that now has children. You know, they're a new parent, right? So they're coming to work as a different person than they were previously.
It's a whole different package.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I think now, because again, I think the pandemic was a big catalyst for kind of highlighting the different needs, the different human needs that we have, and now sometimes just can't undeniably not bring it to our workplace. Is there has never been a more urgent time for compassionate leadership. Again, examining that empathy versus compassion crossroads and checking that for yourself and what's coming up for you.
I think what I'm hearing in that is when you're saying compassion and checking in for yourself and what's coming up for you, you're still having operational balance with treating that person with compassion or from a humane perspective.
Yes, exactly. And one of the things in the research that I've been doing around compassion versus empathy is the compassion is also being looked at as the action that you can take. So how can I help? How can I support? So empathy kind of stops at, I will be in this with you. And again, not necessarily a bad thing, but compassion goes to, I see you, I hear you, what can we do?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's an amazing segue in the sense of providing some practical ways that you can cultivate compassion within your workplace or your leadership style.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think what I'm hearing in there is that one large piece of this would be around active listening.
Absolutely. Just be curious. I think active listening and kind of the step before that is to all managers and leaders acknowledge that across the board, we are just in a different time.
Absolutely.
We just need to lead differently. Some of us need to lead differently than we are. So an acknowledgement and an acceptance of, I may or may not need to do this differently. And then listen.
Absolutely.
Be curious. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Agreed. 100%. And it's like, instead of walking by someone in the hallway and saying, hey, how are you?
Yeah.
It's kind of like superficial, like, how's the weather? It's really leaning in to be like, how are you?
Yeah.
And since the pandemic, I seen one client and they stick with me. They're from British Columbia, and they really normalized, and they still do it to this day, where it's like, when they ask, how are you? The expectation is that you really tell them how they are.
Really tell them, yeah.
And there was one situation where a lady had a toddler, and they recently had a diagnosis of dairy allergy, like profuse vomiting from dairy. Okay.
Yeah.
And so the child got into cheese or something like that.
Oh, God.
And so the woman had to be on the Teams call at like 8:30 a.m. the next day. Didn't get to bed until 2 after cleanup because it was just a hot mess.
Yeah.
And it was totally normal for her to be like, hey, if I'm sounding kind of like the B word today, then it's because I've had 6 hours of sleep. My child was puking and I'm here, but I'm not really here today. So shoot me an email, or, so they were allowed to not only identify what's going on in their personal life, but it was so normalized. It was like, oh, okay, that's how Ange is showing up today, or that's how Maria is showing up today. And how can I help you?
Yeah.
Like, that is the full action or interaction of compassion.
Yeah.
Right? Like, what do you need from me to still be able to perform? And by the way, if you need to go the hell home, what's the point of having a team member in office or online if they're not productive because of family matters? That's why we have time, right? Like, that's why we have vacation or sick time or whatever you want to take, family time, right? I mean, I'm going on a bit of a tangent now, but all this to say, to bring it back into line, is that when we're looking at how to cultivate compassion, it's really around not just active listening, but then reacting in a manner that is super safe and intentional, so that we can make sure that that person's coming back to work in a better headspace.
Absolutely.
Right?
And again, giving ourselves some grace. If you're in a position where this isn't the norm, don't expect to jump right into the feels and that, feel okay for you. So, again, we're saying ways to cultivate compassion. I'm saying one is just acknowledge that we need it. Maybe we don't have it. That's okay. We've got to start somewhere. 2, we're saying active listening, get curious, but in, knowing that you may be asking the questions of how are you, and meaning it. Also running through some scenarios in your head of what someone might say back to you. Right. Are you prepared for the, man, I had a really awful night, or, someone close to me just died, or, my pet's really not well, or whatever it may be. Also knowing that a listening ear is absolutely great. There may also be some stuff brought your way that you may very well need to support or need to do something with. So maybe brainstorming with another teammate or someone like Ange or I around what those scenarios could be, and what supports do you have in place to take it beyond a compassionate listening ear if you need to.
Very much so. And to me, what I'm hearing is like experiential learning or planning, meaning that if a leader came to you and they were like, hey, Coach Maria, I want to exhibit compassion in the workplace, but what if someone comes to me and says their pet dies? Like, I don't have time, and I don't want to sound rude, but I don't have time to stand in the hallway for 20 minutes and listen to about poor Banjo and what happened to them. So like, how do I handle this situation? It feels like for some leaders, what I've seen, emulating this kind of example is that they want to be compassionate, but timing isn't always on their side, and therefore, how do they do it? And so what comes up for me is really about recognizing and going back to not just active listening, but being proactive in how we're responding. So, for example, in that very situation of Banjo, it's contextual, of course, because there could be a million situations. But with this specific one, as a leader, I believe it would be okay for me to be like, hey, Maria, I'm so sorry about Banjo. It sounds like, he was such a big part of your family. It's really hard on you right now. I'd love to hear more about it. I'm running into a meeting. Maybe you and I can catch up over lunch and have a quick chat, or I'm going to be free at 2:30 p.m. Does that sound good to you? And we can pick this up? So you're coming at it from, again, a human-centric approach to say, hey, I see you. I feel you. The compassion in me wants to stay here and talk, but I can't right now. And that's okay too.
Totally.
And I think that's part of the reason why maybe we stay away from the quote unquote feels, is because we don't know how to fully navigate it.
What to do with them.
And there's been such an environment, unpopular opinion, such an environment where there's high pressure to have things right, or you're quote unquote canceled, or there's a lawsuit, or this, that, the other thing. I'm not saying don't be careful or don't be conscientious or don't be correct in the way that you're speaking to people, but rather vulnerability really comes into play for me. So if I followed up in that conversation with Maria and said, hey, I hope you took everything that I said okay.
Right.
And then I just gave space for Maria. Maybe she wants to talk about Banjo more. Maybe she just says, Ange, it was totally fine. I totally get it. I had to put my head down and go back to work anyways.
Oftentimes what I've watched with folks that I've worked with is that there's just a sense of relief of just sharing it and naming it.
That's fair. That's really fair.
And so just
recognition,
naming it. Just being able to candidly share in front of your workmates.
Yes.
This is how I'm showing up today. Often is enough.
And speaking from the seat of a woman, has there ever been an environment where you could say, hey, I'm not feeling well today. It's that time of the month for me. And receive gratitude for you being that honest about your day?
No.
Never, ever.
No.
Like, I remember when I was in my teens, I had really, really, really bad experiences. And to the point where my legs were numb, I could vomit, like migraines, the whole 9 yards. I'm sure others have experienced this as well. And I would go into work like a zombie and like physically look ill. And instead of someone being like, hey, Ange, what do you need today? Like, you need something taken off your plate. People would look at me and be like, oh my God, you look sick. Are you okay? Right? So, and I mean, we're talking about some more extreme-esque examples here of death or injury or illness, but compassion bleeds to even to scenarios where it's very simplistic. It could be compassion around an opinion. As to making sure that if someone said something and maybe they weren't up to speed in the meeting, that we're not making a joke out of that person or that thing that they said, but rather having compassion to just get them up to speed and move on. Right? So I think there's different spectrums, all this to say, when it comes to things like active listening, our recognition and vulnerability, in the sense of how to really ensure that we're fostering an environment where there's collective compassion.
Absolutely. I think my favorite out of all of those is maybe it's two of them. It's giving yourself some grace as a person in the workplace around, oops, maybe we're lacking in the compassion department, but let's just take steps to do better. And then just start with being curious and asking genuine questions about or to your team and see where that leads. And yeah, just having some mechanisms in place to support folks that, they might need some support beyond that listening ear in that very moment.
Right. And so when we're thinking about things like active listening, recognition, even gratitude, vulnerability, all this stuff that we talked about in the how-tos for cultivating compassion as a leader, what do you think would be a first step? Because you said something really powerful earlier where it was like, it's recognizing the fact that we may not have it right or even be doing it right now, but we see a purpose and need to start doing it.
Yeah.
So how does that start, I wonder?
Yeah. I think if we're looking at our work environments and, maybe the symptoms of lack of compassion is that this one size fits all approach. So just a general assessment of how is your team performing? How are your people showing up at work? Do they show up at work really jazzed and then, they're just slogging by noon? Or, is it the opposite? And if so, that's wonderful. But I think first step is just observing, what's working, what isn't. And I would certainly say that if folks are feeling guarded, maybe not sharing, maybe there's some hesitancy around teamwork, working with other folks on the team, maybe that's a good time to kind of take your compassion temperature.
I like that compassion temperature.
I think observing is just step one, a desire on your part to be a compassionate leader and to have a team that embodies compassion. So a desire, and then observe and take stock and see what is happening. And then from there, just get curious and ask some questions.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that 100%. Well, that's a wrap on today's topic. I hope we've given everyone some food for thought on why compassion isn't just a nice to have, but an essential part of leadership. Thank you so much, Maria, for joining me today and for your insights and stories.
Yeah, thanks, Ange. And to everyone listening, remember, compassionate isn't about being soft. It's about showing up for your team with heart and intention. That's what truly drives connection and performance.
Absolutely. And hey, if today's episode resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe, leave us a review, and share it with a friend or colleague who could use a little more compassion in their leadership toolkit. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for listening to the Human Side of Business podcast. I'm glad you could join us. If you enjoyed today's episode and want to stay updated with our latest content, make sure to visit our website. The link can be found in the episode description, where you can subscribe to the podcast, sign up for our newsletter, and learn more about our whole person leadership services. Sounds interesting? Explore the Whole Person Leadership Cohort by Intuity Performance, a unique program that offers unparalleled support to managers on every step of their leadership journey. Our program features evidence-based assessments, workbooks, group coaching, and interactive learning experiences to help you level up your leadership skills. Reach out today to apply to one of our upcoming cohorts. Until next time, take care and stay curious. Thanks for listening to the Human Side of Business podcast. I'm glad you could join us. If you enjoyed today's episode and want to stay updated with our latest content, make sure to visit our website. The link can be found in the episode description, where you can subscribe to the podcast, sign up for our newsletter, and learn more about our whole person leadership services. Sounds interesting? Explore the Whole Person Leadership Cohort by Intuity Performance, a unique program that offers unparalleled support to managers on every step of their leadership journey. Our program features evidence-based assessments, workbooks, group coaching, and interactive learning experiences to help you level up your leadership skills. Reach out today to apply to one of our upcoming cohorts. Until next time, take care and stay curious.